October 30th, 1926, Tigard, Oregon. Almost 100 years ago now, on Halloween weekend in 1926, a man in his 70s, named Marvin A. Clark, left his house in Tigard, Oregon, to make way for Portland to see his daughter. This was a trip that he had made numerous times before without any issues. However, this time would be different. Marvin Clark would seemingly vanish from the face of the earth with no clues as to where he went. The peculiar case of Marvin Clark is widely regarded to be the oldest active missing persons case in the United States. And today, on Unblurring the Unknown, we dive into and explore the story, possible theories, and if we have any leads onto where the body of Marvin Clark could be today. Today, the disappearance of Marvin Clark. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and today on the show, we have another missing persons case. And I decided to head back into the realm of missing persons cases this week, and when I discovered this case, I was, of course, caught off guard by the year this incident took place, and the fact that this is still an active investigation and in no way a closed case. Authorities are still searching for the whereabouts of Marvin Clark to this day, and we do have some hints and theories. However, we will get into those later. Now, just a little disclaimer here before we dive a little bit on into the episode. Because of when this story takes place, a lot of details about it are fuzzy and not fully narrowed down. And that, of course, plays into why Marvin still hasn't been found. But with that all being said, let's get into the story of Marvin Clark and his disappearance. What we know about Marvin Clark is extremely limited. After all, this story takes place in 1926, so we don't have a lot of information that we would normally have if this was a modern-day missing persons case. But let's give a little background to who Marvin Clark was before we dive into the day he disappeared. Marvin Clark was born in 1852, or roughly around this time period, as different articles I read kind of reported different things. And he would be born in Marion County, Iowa. And he would go on to become very educated as he gained degrees at two separate colleges. In 1910, along with his wife and 4 children, Marvin relocated to Oregon, in particular the unincorporated region of Holbrook, and this is confirmed through public records of the time. Marvin would become a pretty significant member of the community during his time living in Oregon, and he would become marshal in the town of Linton. Now, the town of Linton no longer exists, as it has now merged with present-day Portland, but does still exist as a neighborhood within the city. Now, Marvin was obviously a very distinguished man. One of the few photos that exists of him shows him in a full suit, and judging by his education and positions he held like marshal within the state government, we can assume that he was kind of like a gentleman, raised on the societal norms of the late 1800s in the pre-World War I era. Now, one more thing about Marvin Clark that I forgot to mention is the fact that Marvin suffered from partial paralysis in his right arm, and on other kind of portions of the right side of his body, and this affected his ability to move, but it wasn't bad enough to where he couldn't walk around or anything like that, or he needed a wheelchair. So we have a 70-year-old man, kind of very distinguished, very gentlemanly, partial paralysis on the right side of his body. Some reports that I read described Marvin as walking with a cane, but some kind of contradicted this, and this is kind of the whole fuzziness in regards to this whole case, and this will come up numerous other times throughout this episode. But that's kind of the profile we have for Marvin Clark, but that's about it. And again, it's kind of hard to tell whether or not this idea that he was walking with a cane is fact or not. But if, in fact, these two things were true, that he had a cane and that he suffered from the partial paralysis, which pretty much all the articles state that he suffered from the partial paralysis, it would make them pretty good identifiers for people to look to in regards to looking for him when he would go missing. Or at least you would think so, at least. But that is kind of where the information stops. We don't know a whole lot more other than that about Marvin's personal life, how he was raised, and anything along those lines. And again, continues to play into the vagueness of this whole story, and that kind of leads to rampant theories about his disappearance, but of course we will dive into that in theories. Now, when I say this case has a lot of unanswered questions, it's because I mean it. It has a lot of things that don't match up. and stories that kind of contradict each other about what he was doing on the day he disappeared and where he actually went. And no bit of it is concrete at all, which adds to the mystery. Now, as the story goes, Marvin would leave his house in Tigard, Oregon on October 30th, 1926, en route to visit his daughter Sydney in Portland. Now, from what I found, his daughter ran a hotel in Portland, and Marvin had made numerous trips to the city to see his daughter with no issues before. This is a trip that he had taken numerous times and realistically never had any problems on. Now, there is a conflicting report that instead of visiting his daughter, he actually left to go to a doctor's appointment that morning rather than see his daughter, and some sources claim he did a combo of both. So again, more fuzziness in this whole thing. Now, those who say both said that he went to the doctors and then decided, since he was in town, since he was in Portland seeing the doctors, he would go and see his daughter in the city and surprise her. But whatever the story seems to be, the reality was that Marvin Clark never made it to Portland at all, from what we could find. Initial sources claimed that Marvin took a bus from Tigard to Portland, which would have been only a very brief and short trip of roughly a half hour. And other sources claimed he took a stagecoach, which of course is much, much slower, and would have made the trip more like 3 to 4 hours in length. Now, of course, when Marvin's wife had not heard back from him and he didn't arrive home in the days that followed his trip, alarm bells started to ring and that he had never made it to see his daughter, Sydney, either. Now, the family at this point assumed something was wrong and that something went awry in Marvin's trip to Portland, and that's where they would be right. However, there's also this conflicting idea in the research that I did that Sydney, Marvin's daughter, had no idea that Marvin was coming to see her, which kind of further adds to the confusion of this entire case. Let me do a brief little recap here. Now, Marvin goes to Portland to see his daughter, or what we commonly believe. Sydney, the daughter, has no idea that Marvin is coming to see her in Portland. Now, of course, this is all being told by Marvin's wife, and we will get into that a little bit later because she's obviously the one talking to investigators once he disappears. So we have, again, kind of two conflicting-ish stories about Marvin and why he went to Portland and what was his motivations behind going to Portland, and his daughter having no idea that he even went to Portland to come and see her in the first place. So, again, a lot of confusion, a lot of questions already, but again, we will save that here for a little bit. Now, once it was apparent that Marvin was missing, authorities started to launch a full investigation along the route of Tigard to Portland. During this initial search along the route, authorities came up empty-handed. They searched the woods surrounding the area and checked on local businesses, trying to see if anyone had seen Marvin at all on his trip, and they came up with nothing. It was almost like he completely vanished off the face of the earth. Now, keep in mind, this was also the 1920s. This is not modern-day America, and the area in which Marvin went missing were not like modern-day America at all. The roads in Tigard were not like the roads in Portland, even though much of America had made the switch by this time to the modern-day automobile and streetlights and electricity and things of the sort. The rural areas around Portland, mostly Tigard and other areas, did not have this, and these roads were dirt roads. They had no illumination and were right in the middle of the woods. And these could be very dangerous if you're out at night because, again, it did not have these things that Portland or other main cities had, with the streetlights and everything like that. You're in the woods and you're walking on dirt roads. So these are undeveloped areas in the middle of the woods that can be kind of sketchy if you're walking alone in the middle of the night or if you happen to get lost out there in the middle of the night. It's just very undeveloped, and that was the 1920s in this area of the country. Now, investigators of the time were also very limited. They only had a limited amount of automobiles they could use to aid in the search, and communication systems of the time were not readily available, so any clues that they had were based solely off of eyewitness sightings, which they, unfortunately and flat out, just didn't have. The only compelling piece of evidence we have in regards to the disappearance of Marvin Clark, firstly, is the idea that he was spotted in hotels surrounding Portland and in the Portland area in the days following his disappearance on November 2nd and November 3rd. He was supposedly spotted by two different eyewitnesses who described a man in his 60s and 70s wearing a dark suit and slacks. Now, there is also an unconfirmed report of an eyewitness supposedly spotting Marvin at a bus station nearby in Portland. However, that again is unconfirmed. It is impossible to know whether or not these sightings by these eyewitnesses were real or not. And you would think that if these were in fact real, these eyewitnesses would have mentioned that fact that this man that they thought they saw and that they thought was Marvin would have maybe a slight trouble moving, or this being because of Marvin's slight paralysis in his right arm and kind of right side of his body. But to my knowledge, on these supposed sightings, there was no details about that. They don't go into depth. Hey, this person kind of walked around very staggeredly. It looked like he had trouble getting around. That would make me believe that this was Marvin. But there's no information to go along with these eyewitness sightings, rather than somebody says, hey, I saw an elderly man in a dark suit and slacks that kind of looked like him. That was it. That's the extent of the eyewitness sightings that I was able to find during my research. And that, to me, is completely unconfirmed at that point, because you can be any elderly man in a dark suit and slacks, and that doesn't mean that you're Marvin Clark. So these sightings in and around Portland, to me, I take them with a grain of salt. And I took them with a grain of salt when doing my research, because I didn't know how serious to take these sightings, because again, there was very, very little information to go off of for these sightings. Now, to add to the idea that he traveled to Portland to see a doctor for a visit, if in fact that part of the story is true, we don't have any doctors, or even Marvin Clark's doctor, coming out and making a statement that maybe he was not seen at his office that day, or maybe he did see him at that office that day. We have no evidence to support that idea either, in that he saw a doctor at all that day in Portland. And really all we have is hearsay. And that's kind of that theory, that he went to see his doctor, but kind of back to the theory of, he went to see his daughter. Now, we know that he would never make it to see his daughter in the first place. And between this, that maybe his daughter not knowing that he was coming to visit her to begin with, and the kind of unconfirmed theory that he was going to see a doctor, and that was the reason he was going to Portland, we don't have any doctors coming out and saying that, hey, I saw Marvin Clark, I treated Marvin Clark that day, or Marvin Clark never made it to my office that day. We have nothing on that. I can't find any research on that. Other content creators who have covered this story have not been able to find any information on that. And again, this is because this story is taking place in 1926, and the record keeping that we traditionally see in missing persons cases is just not there, because again, it is 1926. And this whole story just reeks of strange and weird from top to bottom. Now, eventually this case, of course, would be lost to time, as no new leads would form, and the hope of finding Marvin Clark alive eventually faded into obscurity. That was until a day in 1986, when a group of loggers who were working in between the areas of Portland and Tigard stumbled upon a shocking discovery. They discovered a body, but more like a skeleton, because it was pretty much that was all what was left. And upon examination of this skeleton these loggers found in the woods and the area surrounding the skeleton, investigators found a variety of things. They found a pocket watch, a Fraternal Order of Eagles pocket knife, a 1888 Liberty Head nickel, a 1919 penny, a .38 caliber revolver, and one spent shell casing. Upon further investigation from the crime scene investigators, they discovered a single gunshot wound to the skull of the body, seemingly showing that whoever this person was ultimately took their own life. However, it further adds fire to the mystery. Could this skeleton that these loggers discovered in the woods, could this be Marvin Clark? Could it have been possible that he just walked out in the woods and took his own life? I know that sounds a little crazy, and that honestly makes me doubtful, but we will get into that in theories here in a little bit. Now, investigators labeled this skeleton, this body originally found, as John Doe, as they didn't have enough evidence to connect that this body found in the woods was Marvin Clark, even though the clothing around the body and his belongings would point to someone who maybe lived in the area during the same time as Marvin. Now, we had, at this point, when they initially discovered the skeleton, they had no way to prove it without DNA evidence, and that is where they went next. It turns out that the authorities were able to track down and get in contact with Marvin Clark's great-great-granddaughter and family to see if she wanted to provide a DNA sample to see if there could be any relation between her and the John Doe. Now, if there was, this would confirm that this body was Marvin Clark, and it would put an end to this entire mystery. However, and unfortunately, that wouldn't be the case. Turns out the DNA from the great-great-granddaughter of Marvin Clark and extended family did not match the DNA in the skeleton found by the loggers, and that now officially becomes a dead end. Now, there is one last tidbit of information to this case that I haven't shared yet, and it could be our most compelling piece of evidence yet. And with that being our most compelling piece of evidence, it could also be our most confusing. Now, a few days after Marvin's disappearance, now we aren't fully sure on the date because, again, this was 1926 and record keeping wasn't great and it wasn't very firm as it is now, Mary, Marvin's wife, would receive a postcard in the mail from Bellingham, Washington, that was addressed to, I'm assuming, her or maybe the Clark family. However, that little bit of it is also unknown. And this postcard from Bellingham, Washington, was written from someone claiming to be Marvin Clark. Now, the contents of what was on this postcard remains unknown, as we don't really have any proof that this postcard even exists besides Mary's testimony. And this postcard, from what I could find, certainly wasn't on the internet. And from what I was able to find in my research, nobody else had found it either. And that we were pretty much, I shouldn't say grasping at straws here, but that is what we have, and we're going off of the testimony of Mary saying, hey, I got this postcard from Bellingham, Washington that is supposedly addressed from Marvin, and the thing is that this postcard was virtually unreadable. The handwriting was so bad, and from some resources that I dug through said that this postcard was disconnected. Like it was virtually unreadable, it was illegible, but it was still addressed to either Mary Clark or the Clark family from someone claiming to be Marvin Clark. But other than that, we don't know if this was truly Marvin or not. And from what I could find, we don't know if Mary said that the handwriting was that of Marvin's or anything like that. And I couldn't find any information about a possible cipher that somebody was able to do from the postcard. All we know is that it arrived to Marvin's wife, supposedly addressed from Marvin and postmarked from Bellingham, Washington, thus opening another whole can of worms and another part of this mystery. Now, is it possible that Marvin survived this trip to wherever he was going and ended up traveling to Bellingham, Washington? And if so, why did Marvin go there? Now, Bellingham, Washington is located at the very northern part of the state, and it is very close to the border of Canada in the Canadian town of Abbotsford. The town of Bellingham also acts as an active port city with numerous ferries coming in and out of Alaska and shipping containers. Now, obviously, on the surface, it seems like a nice city, but why would Marvin go there? If, in fact, Marvin used a bus to leave his home in Tigard, like some have suspected, it would make sense that he could make it to Bellingham in a few days, even shorter than that, and then that would give him enough time to send the postcard, have that be shipped to the Clark household in a few days for where Mary to receive it, and that timeline would kind of match up. But it still begs the question if, in fact, did he even send this postcard to begin with? What was he doing so far north in Bellingham, and why was he doing it without his wife's knowledge? Now, to go there, or to make the trip, Marvin Clark would have to lie to his wife about going to see his daughter in Portland, and to me, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But, of course, people do have secrets all the time, and it certainly wouldn't be unheard of for someone to completely ditch their family and to try to start a new life somewhere. We've seen that in other missing persons cases. We've seen that in society. People say, hey, I want to start anew, I want to run away, I want to do something different with my life, and they just run away and start a new life. But, of course, let's circle back into theories. I was holding back and going straight headfirst and diving into that theory, but I got a little bit left here, and then, of course, we're going to go into theories and recap everything here. But with that being said, that kind of ends the story. That's all we know about Marvin Clark's disappearance and kind of where we stand in terms of finding him and what even happened to him in the first place. And before we go into theories, let's recap, again, this entire story. Marvin Clark leaves his home in Tigard, Oregon, en route to Portland, saying that he's going to go see his daughter. He never makes it there. His daughter says that she had no knowledge of him coming to visit in the first place, and we have conflicting reports saying that maybe he was going to the doctor's office instead of seeing his daughter. Now, we have eyewitnesses in Portland saying that they saw him on November 2nd and November 3rd at hotels in the area, describing him as an older man in his 60s to 70s wearing a dark suit and slacks. However, there is no details provided on whether or not he was walking with some sort of limp or a cane or anything like that that we would think to use as an identifier for that to actually be Marvin. Now, we have the postcard that Mary received a few days after Marvin went missing, postmarked from Bellingham, Washington, supposedly addressed from Marvin Clark to the Clark family, and it's completely unreadable, illegible, and we have no idea what it says. Did you keep up with me there? I hope you all did. And again, you can ask yourself a whole bunch of questions just in that little recap I just did here in about 30, 45 seconds. We have so many questions, and let's dive into them right now with theories and my own personal opinions on this entire case. Now, this first theory that I have might seem like a common one, and that being suicide. Now, perhaps Marvin was having something going on in his personal life, and that affected him mentally. Maybe having to deal with the fact that he was partially paralyzed on his right side took a toll on him, and possibly maybe some family issues could have played into that as well. Who knows, as I am just speculating and throwing everything out there in terms of possibilities. Now, we know that the John Doe that was discovered nearby wasn't that of Marvin's, and we have the mystery there of whose body that could be. But maybe they tracked down the wrong person, or perhaps one of Marvin's children were not conceived by him, and that just happened to be the child that they were able to trace the bloodline of and test for the DNA sample for the John Doe. I know that might be a little far-fetched, but due to the idea that we have no idea who this skeleton in the woods belongs to, and we don't have any other missing persons cases that were reported during this time period, I don't think it's totally outlandish in the realm of possibilities. Now, our second theory is that he ran away to start a new life. And this theory that instead, of course, of him disappearing off the face of the earth, rather he chose to not be found by running away from his family and wanting to start a new life. Now, this theory gets brought up a lot in articles that I read, and this theory comes up in a lot of, of course, unanswered missing persons cases where no other theories seem to fit. And on the surface, maybe perhaps he ran away to Bellingham, Washington, or perhaps even crossed the border into Canada, trying to get away from his family that he had in Tigard, and the motivations for him doing so, we obviously have no idea. Now, this theory, I am not a huge fan of. It doesn't seem like to me that a man like Marvin Clark, who had a whole family, had a marriage, had a successful career by all accounts, would want to run away from his family while he had a health condition and in his partial paralysis to start new. Now, we aren't talking about someone who is 20 to 30 years old. We're talking about someone who, from what I could find, is in like his mid-70s, which that's pretty old for this time period as well. Now, it just wouldn't make any sense for him to run away. Nothing there adds up for me, and I think is just a very lazy theory for those who seriously consider it. Now, our third theory is kind of a two-parter. Now, in this being either he had a health issue or got lost. Now, the first one of this is, of course, that he was obviously a very old man, and that it was very possible that he could have had some sort of medical emergency on his travels and unfortunately passed away. However, that would account for his body being somewhere. That would have, his body would be somewhere if that was the case. And the only way I see the health issue being a probable cause, like I feel like if he had a health issue on the trip to Portland, whether it was in the bus, whether it was in the stagecoach, whether it was on the road, we would have found his body by now. Like, that just doesn't make any sense. So for the only way for this theory to work is that I'm thinking is that he made it to Portland, and then he had some type of heart condition, or heart condition or medical condition or something along those lines, and passed away while there in the city, and his body was picked up and brought to the city morgue, and he had no identification on his person, and maybe he sat unclaimed there in the morgue until maybe he was cremated because they had nobody come and claim his body. Again, I don't really know how body disposal worked in the 1920s in Portland, Oregon. If anybody does know, shoot me an email or shoot me maybe a direct message just for context to this story, because I have no clue. Maybe that was it. He had this health condition. He got picked up by the city. He got brought to the morgue. Nobody claimed his body. He got cremated, and there's no paperwork of it because, again, this is 1926. And if there was any record, I feel like that information would be insanely hard to come by, especially considering it has been almost 100 years after the fact. Now, the second part of this theory is that maybe he could have gotten lost, which strikes me as unlikely since he had traveled that route numerous times before, and given how he had lived through the area for numerous years, he would be somewhat familiar with the terrain and environment. Although if he was caught outside for any particular reason, maybe he could have been killed by a predator or succumbed to the elements. However, to me, that still doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because if he took a stagecoach or a bus, he wouldn't have had to walk, and that would have involved him getting lost. Now, what would make the most sense here is perhaps a combo of both, where Marvin was suffering from some early stage dementia that he didn't know about. He got disoriented on his way to the stagecoach or bus and completely just walked in the woods, got lost, and died. And that is why we haven't been able to find his body. The part of this theory I kind of like. Same way with making it to Portland with no ID and his body being claimed by the morgue and disposed of. If he took a bus, it stands to reason that if he needed his ID or a form of it. But maybe he didn't need one if he took a stagecoach. Regardless, this is a compelling theory. However, it wouldn't explain the Bellingham, Washington postcard. Now, this last theory is murdered and disposed of. And this is that someone had murdered Marvin for some unknown reason, disposed of his body, and made the fake postcard from Bellingham, Washington, and sent it to his wife as a red herring to try and make it look like he ran away from home and his family rather than somebody killing him for some unknown reason. It is a compelling theory on the surface. However, the only way this makes sense is if the person who killed him also knew him, and that he knew he had to stage it to look like Marvin ran away from home when that wasn't the case. He was murdered. Now, perhaps this could be some type of old coworker who maybe didn't like him very much, or maybe you could go in the completely opposite direction of this and say that his wife killed him. Now, why would I say that? Because, honestly, think about it for a second. His wife is the only one who could attest to the fact that he was going to Portland to see his daughter. Many sources that I found said that his daughter, Sydney, as we've covered just in these past few minutes, Sydney had no idea that he was coming to see her in the first place. The sources of people saying they saw Marvin in Portland could have been blanket misidentifications of Marvin rather than actual sightings, which I genuinely believe. And that being because they did not describe, Marvin's gimp, or that he was partially paralyzed, or maybe even that he had a cane. They didn't say any of that. Now, again, as I said before, it could be easy just to see an elderly man wearing a suit and think that, hey, that's our guy, when in fact it isn't. Perhaps Marvin was an abusive partner. Now, of course, we have no evidence to prove whether he was or he wasn't, or that if Mary killed him. We have no evidence of this, and this is merely speculatory, but of course this is just a theory. Maybe Mary killed him, disposed of his body in a place only she would know. Now, it's not as far-fetched as a theory as you would think, but the fact that we don't have a whole lot of background information on the case in general makes the theories kind of run wild on this one, and they are all very plausible theories, except for the running away one, in my personal opinion. And these are all these theories that have either happened before in other missing persons cases, or just flat out aren't outside of the realm of possibility. Now, in my personal opinion about this whole case, I think he was either killed by someone he didn't like, and that's why we get the postcard from Bellingham, Washington. And I also think maybe it could have been his wife who killed him as well, and the sightings were a mistaken identity. Now, I also like the idea of him getting to Portland and having a heart attack or some other health issue, and then laying in a morgue with no ID, but of course that doesn't account for the postcard. And of course, I think the postcard is a big piece in this entire story and a big piece of the disappearance. Honestly, I like the idea that his wife killed him. I know that might be a little cliche in terms of missing people's disappearances and things of that nature, and that it's always the ones who's closest to you that usually commit something like this, but I think it's very practical. I think Mary could have staged the postcard from Bellingham, Washington to make it seem like he ran away from home to get the cops off of her trail. Again, it's not unheard of for loved ones to kill their partners or anything like that. We've seen that time and time and time again, and it's actually kind of quite common at this point, scary enough. And again, as cliche as that might think, that's this theory that makes sense. Again, Mary was the only one saying that Marvin was going to Portland. Sydney had no idea that her dad was coming to visit her in the first place. So that makes it just kind of, it points the fingers back on Mary. And the police obviously didn't find anything in the woods. They didn't have any eyewitness sightings to go off of. Maybe because he didn't travel to Portland at all. Maybe Mary, again, killed Marvin right there on their property, disposed of the body right there on the property, and staged an entire story saying that Marvin just went to go to Portland and to see his daughter and just never came back. But that is, of course, my personal opinion. Feel free to send me your own personal opinions through Instagram direct message. Put them down in the comment sections. Talk about it, what you think happened to Marvin Clark. But with that being said, that is going to end this week's episode of Unblurring the Unknown. I hope you all enjoyed it. This was definitely a different one in the realm of missing persons cases, and a very old one. Again, one of the oldest active missing persons cases. I know that there are a couple in my research that I found that are actually older. However, they are not active cases to my knowledge. So this one's still active from everything that I found. There's people still investigating this case, and that's what makes it the oldest active missing persons cases rather than the oldest missing persons case in general, if that makes any sense. But again, with that being said, that is going to end this episode of Unblurring the Unknown over the disappearance of Marvin Clark. Again, I hope you all enjoyed it. If you were listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. If you were listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out with the algorithm gods, and I greatly appreciate it. Feel free to also go ahead and follow me on TikTok at Unblurring the Unknown, where I'll be posting 1-minute breakdowns of all the episodes that I put out. I have to admit, I've been slacking on that front in recent weeks. Again, I've had a lot of things in my personal life come up, and with kind of a move and other things in my life with job and career change. So obviously I had to address those first, so I hope to get back onto the front of doing the TikToks as much as I can going forward. But you can also go ahead and follow me on Instagram at Unblurring the Unknown. I post the cover art from each week's episode. I go over there and I post that there. The cover art, again, none of my research, I do all my research myself. There's none of it that is AI generated or anything like that. But a disclaimer, my cover art is AI generated. I just throw it into a prompt, and sometimes I kind of edit it and tweak it and things of that nature. So that is the only thing of my content that is AI created. Other than that, I do all of the research myself, and it's a long process every single week, but I enjoy it, and I wouldn't have it any differently. But you can also send me topic suggestions to my email. That's unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. Send those on over to me. It honestly helps me out, sending me topic suggestions. I add them to the queue, gives me some ideas. Some weeks I'm in kind of a creative rut about what to report on next. If you send me a topic suggestion, odds are I shoot that right up to my queue. I've done topic suggestions before, and I've pretty much liked every single one that somebody has sent to me. So yeah, send them on over to me. Send me those topic suggestions at Instagram direct message to my email. You can do both of those things, and I will get it and add it to my episode queue as soon as I possibly can. And who knows? I will most likely cover it in an episode. It just kind of depends on the week and everything I kind of got planned out. But yes, I will definitely get to those episode suggestions if you send them on over to me. But again, that is going to do it for this week's episode over the disappearance of Marvin Clark, and I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all on the next one.